No matter where you come from, the birth of a baby is an occasion that evokes all kinds of traditions. Religious traditions, cultural traditions, family traditions, and of course different families and cultures have different traditions about all kinds of things when you do when the baby is born. When we were out visiting the Navajo, they told us about how one of their traditions around children is that who's ever holding the baby when it laughs for the first time has to throw a party for the whole family. I thought that was a really nice one. In our family, we had a lot of traditions around the baptismal gown. My mother bought something fancy and expensive when my older brother was born, and all of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have worn it. It's very lovely. One congregation I served, one of the grandmothers made a fairly simple white baptismal gown for her first grandchild. And I love this tradition. Embroidered the child's name near the hem and the day of the baptism. And then as more grandchildren came along and more people used the gown, all of their names and dates were embroidered. It was all white, and the embroidery was white, but the day and the names were recorded on the gown. And I thought that was lovely because it reminded them not only that they were part of this family, but also that they were part of the community of faith. So in the gospel for today, Mary and Joseph did the same sort of thing, fulfilled their religious and cultural traditions. In the Gospel of Luke, the parents of Jesus respond to his birth in part by attending to the obligations from Leviticus 12 for purification. If you have a baby boy, you can go back after 40 days, which is today, 40 days from Christmas. If you have a girl, it takes longer. You have to wait for 80 days. But Jesus was a boy, so here we are. Those ancestral traditions are a reminder that he was born into the covenant established by God, between God and the people. And then Luke also adds another celebration that comes from Exodus 13, that every firstborn male shall be designated as holy to the Lord. And this verse, of course, is set in the context of God's deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Children born into slavery belong to the slave master. By consecrating them to God, the Israelites affirmed that they were God's people, belonging to God alone, who always keeps the promises. And so this dedication of the firstborn males affirmed their new identity in God. Mary and Joseph had no family with them when they went to Jerusalem that day. They were alone without extended family and friends. I'm always thankful that Simeon and Anna were there to welcome them and welcome this small, brand new family. I actually served as a parish pastor for 15 years in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the things I remember the most was how much young families appreciated the older members of the congregations. Often their own parents and grandparents lived far away, but people in the congregation filled that role to a certain extent and surrounded, especially the young children, with the sense that they were part of something that went throughout the generations. I'm sure some of that's true here at St. Timothy's. And so Simeon and Anna were there for them. But they were also much more than kindly elders in the community who welcomed a young family. They were both, according to this story, filled with the Holy Spirit and responding to God's lead. They knew their scriptures and understood the promises of God in the prophet Isaiah. Simeon's song, the Nunc Dimittis, called in Latin, which we've often sung after communion, is all verses from the later chapters of Isaiah. So they knew the scriptures and they knew God's promises. They were people of hope who prayed for the restoration of Israel. And of course, if you knew the history of that time, you know that the restoration of Israel meant ending the Roman occupation. They were people committed to the righteousness of God in every sense. They hoped and prayed that God would set things right. Perhaps because of her name, Anna made a big impression on me, even when I was very young. So I've known this Bible story my whole life, or at least since I was about 3. Her simple model of evangelism shaped my faith, and shaped the way I've shared my faith throughout my life. forms of evangelism. In fact, we had one a couple of weeks ago in our gospel when Jesus said to the disciples, "Come and see." That's about as easy as it gets. If you want to share your faith with somebody, the easiest thing for you to do is invite them along to something your church is doing or here for worship on Sunday morning. Just say to them, "Come and see." And in fact, right after that gospel, Philip does the same thing with Daniel. But this is the second lesson in evangelism we get this year in the season of Epiphany. Anna tells what she has seen and heard. She's a witness. She sees with the eyes of faith and then shares what she sees. She becomes the first evangelist, telling everyone about the presence of God in her life and about what God is doing in the world. She's a good model for us. And of course, all of us can think of people, I'm sure there are some in this congregation, who see God at work all the time and say something about it. Some of us aren't quite that good, and one of the things I want you to do is practice this, okay? It takes a little practice to pay attention to what God is doing. At the end of each day, you can think back through your own day and say, where was God present in the people that I met, or in the things that happened, or in the work that I was able to do? So think through, pay attention, where God is present. And then the first people to practice on is probably one another, because everybody's looking for God's presence. And so just talk about it a little bit. Here's where I saw God in my life in the last day or in the last week. Because if we practice it with one another, we'll all get a little better at sharing our faith in that way with others who do not know God's presence in their lives. One of the reasons I think campus ministry is so important is that we are with young people at a time when they are growing to adult faith. Truly, they're growing in every possible way when they go to college, learning how to manage their time and their money, figuring out their own priorities about relationships, but also about study and work and all kinds of things. And their world is expanding. They're being exposed to so many new ideas. And really, one of my biggest priorities is to help them so that their faith keeps up with everything else. We want them to have as deep a faith as they have a deep understanding of whatever it is they're studying. And of course, during those years, they're questioning, figuring out what they really believe, but also then working out how to share that faith. Here, Anna gives us the model. She is looking for the redemption of Jerusalem, fasting and praying daily in the temple. Her hope was in God, but it probably also had a lot to do with throwing over the occupation and ending the grip of Rome. Now she sees this child, just a few weeks old, with his parents who are very poor and can only afford to offer the very minimum sacrifice. And she begins to understand something about God. In this child, she sees and understands the vulnerability of God. Things are going to change for God's people, not because of weapons and armies. This child will do things differently, and it will change everything. As St. Paul says, God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Or another verse from Isaiah, Isaiah 49, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" Here Anna is perceiving that God's power is made known in weakness. And that fact alone changes the way we see the world. It will change us from within, and it will change our response of faith. Even in these first chapters of Luke's Gospel, when Jesus is just a few weeks old, we know where his story is headed. We know where the power of God's love will come face to face with the power of armies and governments. We know the vulnerability of human life, but we also know that death will never have the last word. The cross changes us. strong enough to take on anything. It changes the way we see the world. It changes our ministry. It changes our witness. The first parish I ever served was Prince of Peace in Missoula, Montana. And in those days, we actually shared our congregation with the Roman Catholic parish that was building a building, except it took them a really long time to raise the money, so they were there for about 20 years. And it was a wonderful relationship between the two congregations. This was a very simple sanctuary, and in the front, it was probably as tall as the tallest part, and a plain white wall at the back, and in the center, a cross, similar to this one, but tall and very thin in that space. And so we made all kinds of things that went beside it and around it, and lots of fun liturgical art projects in those days. For Christmas, we had a stuffed nativity set, so that you could drop the pieces and they wouldn't break. A lot of children in this young congregation. And so one of the traditions was that every year we put the nativity set somewhere else. One year we used the altar as a kind of stable. We cut a lot of Christmas trees in Montana, and so one year we had a little grove of trees off to the side, and the stable was there. And then one year, the Catholic priest had an idea that he could hang a shelf. And the shelf was hung just under the cross, just a simple shelf. And then on Christmas Eve, the children joined in the procession and brought forward the figures. So as they came up, first we put the shepherds off to one side and some sheep, and then the wise men on the other side, and maybe a camel or something. Then Mary and Joseph closer to the center. And finally, the last child brought up the little manger and the baby Jesus. And when I took that stuffed doll toy, manger and baby, and put it there in the center, right at the base of the cross, the whole congregation just gasped. It was visually such a powerful moment for us. Candles, trees, lights, the whole thing. Beautiful Christmas Eve. And yet in that moment, we knew where his life was leading. We knew that God's power would be made perfect in the weakness of this child. We knew God's love for us, which would reshape everything. And so Cindy and Amanda see that same word of the cross and share it with us today. May God give us eyes to see and ears to hear the presence of God in this story.